And I just quickly want to thank Mahela for letting me take part in this occasion again. It's a real honour, and thanks also to Sue and Carol, the editors. This year they were good enough to print or publish, let's say, my sentiments about the anthology in the anthology, so I won't have to repeat them upstage. You can read them in the book itself, but basically it's a very unlikely anthology, so I think even if the contents weren't as great as they are, the fact that it exists is enough to celebrate. But as I said, I won't repeat my sentiments, I'll just get straight into it. Between Dusk and Dawn was where I first learned to write. The first memories I have are of night terrors. I used to get night terrors that afflicted me as a child, and I'd lay awake in a lather of sweat, kind of paralysed with terror, waiting for this trance of fear to dissipate when the dawn started to arrive. What I was afraid of when I was a kid and I was experiencing these things were the dreams that I was going to have if I fell asleep. And to guard against that, and to guard against going to sleep, I conjured up in my mind's eye this kind of shade, it's like an ink black spirit, kind of like a ghost or something like that. And for me, that represented the terror of the dreams, and I would it'd be hovering in the air in my mind, and I'd encase it in this kind of makeshift prison. Maybe like a gold, I would imagine something, like a golden orb comes around this black spirit and traps it, maybe the size of a coffin or something. And then I'd encase that coffin or that golden orb in some other kind of prison, maybe something the size of a house. And then I'd encase that in some sort of prison, maybe the size of a shopping centre or something. And eventually the whole earth would have to be swallowed up in this prison. And then that prison would have to be placed into this kind of intergalactic, gigantic encasement, and so on and endlessly until the sun started to come up. And then it kept me from falling asleep and kept me distracted from the terror that I was feeling. And I think that for me is kind of the beginning of a habit of writing, of, if you like, a really kind of primitive way of generating worlds and living in them to an extent at the expense of reality. And so maybe for that reason I've always considered there to be a link between dreams and writing. And the dream world is obviously where things that are unresolved, sort of haunting images and emotions, they come back to the sort of transitioning consciousness, just like the memories and ideas of a notebook coming back with new visions and revisions. And that's what Oliver Sacks begins this anthology, his epigraph begins this anthology talking about that. And I can't really, if I thought ahead, I would have brought in an image of it, but you saw it. I just want to mention the Oliver Sacks epigraph about visions and returning to memories in a notebook. He's sitting next to this painting that was up on the screen a moment ago. It's Sunset with Boat. And I can't show it to you, so I'll just quickly describe the way it looks to me. It's kind of, it positions the observer in the boat, and it's in blackened water that kind of runs to blue in a mirroring of the clouds above, and it's all sort of heading towards this cityscape horizon, and above that the blue clouds are mirroring what you see in the water. And when I was looking at that image, for some reason, I don't know why, it put me in mind of one of the most famous works in English language, in English literature, and it's The Heart of Darkness. And it's a novel narrated, if you haven't read it, I'm sure you have, you might have forgotten even if you have, but it's narrated by a guy called Marlowe. He's a seaman on a ship that's anchored in the River Thames, and he stops midway through what he's narrating. He stops midway through this novel, and he says, "It seems to me I'm trying to tell you a dream. I am making a vain attempt because no relation of a dream can convey the dream sensation, that commingling of absurdity, surprise and bewilderment in a tremor of struggling revolt, that notion of being captured by the incredible which is of the very essence of dreams." And then he goes quiet for a while and he says, no, it's impossible. I can't do it. It's impossible to convey the life sensation of any given epoch of one's existence, that which makes its truth, its meaning, its subtle and penetrating essence. it is impossible. We live as we dream, alone. And the first English work in this collection, I think, Demise of the Book by Paul O'Loughlin, seems to me to contend with this same very impossibility of words, the rise of rage at an insufficient spill amongst the detritus of words which rings out from the breast that's fluttering with a bibliographical anxiety, and the unsober poet finds their literature by the side of the road, drying its perishing wings. And the next English one is Diane Sakusa's Heirloom, which resonates with a similar kind of attentiveness to the act of working in words, but here the sentiment is a resolute one. It's a determination to resist the impermanence through poetry, and the poet's will to create is encapsulated in the metaphor that every child knows, that futile gesture of building a castle out of sand, and the quiet poise and poignancy of their crumbling structure. Alex Pleskin's Away Flying is a kind of, to my ears, is a kind of love song where the confounding dance of words and the meanings turn away from the mystery of abstraction, and the focus of tiny materials of life comes to the front. It's the sound of birds and the little white flowers on the grass beneath the poet's feet. Now buttons pressed and words written like a smoked cigar, like sex, like suicide, like turning and walking away from beauty and escaping from time, from life and death, but being caught on a leash and hovering in place over the tiny mushrooms in the flowery grass. And from that distance, we drop into a day in the life of Peter Cartwright's Not Ready, where the grey light is suspended in a between time. It's dusk, dawn, morning meds, night pills, alone and together all at once. And we are staying and going, and all the world is pulled across precise glimpses of tiny symbols, a blister pack, susurrating traffic, the padded drum of soft pajamas, and then all is snapped back into linearity by a woman who comes into the kitchen and says, "Why aren't you ready?" Like Whitman looking at a blade of grass, or Blake with eternity in the palm of his hand, J.N. de Stey can see a familial history balanced on the solid loop of a ring. There's a tiny symbol of promise which is always at risk of slipping over the arthritic thickness of our knuckles. And we stare at the age of our hands, where time makes all of us our mothers. And like some primitive cursing bone points to the inevitability of death, not only ours, but those we've already lost, that we keep their keepsakes on our bodies. C.A. Broadrib's work takes us from the microscopic of life and death and brings us into the social world in a matter of perspective. And it reveals that conspiratorial reversal of expectation which my father, who was a tax man, he was a tax agent, he used to tell me repeatedly, those who beg are not always poor. Also, I suspected some sort of commentary on the unaffordability of Sydney's housing market, but leave the political to you and the author. With He Who Would Valiant Be, Thomas Torp provides a portrait of ceremony and memorial, where there's this estrangement between traditions and their meanings, as there always is in life, and there's a fading flag, a shortening roll call, PowerPoints leading sermons, and a contrast between ancient forms and new modes, and the veterans, those people who should feel most about this disjunction, carry on unperturbed, living on in the light talk of now as they pass the biscuits around. Andrea Pore's fiction begins with a melancholic tour through this territory that they're calling pseudo-Burbia, where sinister acts pin places onto a memory's map. But in two quick shifts of perspective, the narrator leaps from a scrap of dream into the present, sitting on a bus, listening to a young girl count aloud until she loses her place somewhere between 87 and 89. Perspectives are at play in Abdullah Noman's poetry as well. The poet is stealing glimpses over a round table at a lover's face, upon which the ritual prayer of dawn is moving across the impassive landscape, glowing a haloed light that's warm and chaste as thoughts of home. Norm Fairbairn's brings us back to rings, but here they've been taken off, and the hands they leave naked are bent to clenched fists and hearts so dark with despair and doubt they leave their owners adrift, alone as astronauts before the pale moon. And from the wedding rings to the rings of a circus in Anna Maria Belgian's Florica and the Lions, which is a folkloric tale told in an idiom-laden conversation between two men about their long-gone companion, or acquaintance maybe is better to say, who's a lion tamer, who happens to have come to Australia but has found that there's no call for lion taming down under. And in his despair, he takes to sleeping with carnivores at night. And eventually all his hopes and dreams end up neatly piled in the corner of their enclosure along with his bones. At first, Danny Draper's poem might sound like the song of some unrequited lover attracted to his opposite, but by its end it's more to do with the mystery of the heavens and a shared glow on the curves of Venus between immense and immutably separate spheres. And those heavenly bodies continue in vassal pornos, ponaros? Sorry?
Yes, ponaro.
Ponar. The front door, where worlds as black as death live in the eyes of beings who ride in the air and keep the stars moving on their way home, and a single smile can smear across the daylight against all the fears of the world like ice cream smudged into the trailing air. A Pharaoh's Friday is a tale of contrasts clashing in an oversaturated abundance of light that turns a tale into a sort of lighthouse in the crumbling grey of the suburban architecture. The narrator spies the light while surveying the streets where grass swallows park benches and the air is without the scent of salt or the feel of sand, and ocean's endless blue is out of sight. In search of a space to place herself, she dresses in black and puts on her gold and turquoise ring and goes with the soft-shouldered women awaiting with open arms. Loredana Tudor Tomescu's poem, genetically modified, begins in memory, with these ravines between lovers filled with empty bottles and the jagged prick of unspoken words, but it ends in invitation, the poet offering herself as an edible subject, one that might satisfy the hunger in another's eyes, but she asks you to beware of side effects, like the eternal longing and unquenchable devotion that might follow. In clear hikes the rainbow's dawn, sunshine breaks over Parramatta Stadium and falls on a park where a shadowless being watches over a mourning woman. The woman can't see this entity, but there's a bond between them that sets a cold heart beating, and a long-forgotten feeling of warmth radiates through an invisible hand when they connect. The narrator of Belinda Kirby's Dusk and Dawn might very well be walking in the same dawn, the same streets as Hakes, but to her eyes dawn's cold kisses and the pale morning begins to take on a strange unfamiliarity, and the star at the centre of our lives becomes a sucked chopper chop, doomed to be stolen at the end of day by the black lace of night over fairy floss clouds dissolving on dusk's tongue. Frances Ann's title, Amanda Lee, is some kind of pop culture reference that I'm too old to know without using Google, which I did. And the fiction, it takes place in a country I've never been to. And it's a land where the narrator awakes to the social dramas that occupy a young person's heart. Awkward and self-aware, vital and uncertain, with hormonal outbreaks making their way to the surface of the skin, and the knocking thud of somebody else's sex beating at every wall. And from the relentless energy of youth to the minimalist restraint of K.C. Tompkins' poetry, and the still sorrow of metastatic vision, where a bus sighs and a cough is housed in brick and a tree without leaves faces down the uncertainty of the long stretch before winter. And from this shade to the shadow cast by a windmill on a clouded day in Mihaela Cristescu's poems, which draw the reader in like the light at the tunnel's end, where if hands could only hold the light, then the right words might be spoken, and eyes enlarged with walled eternity, we might wind our way over an amaranth river that flows like thought around the walls of a place where we once set our bikes. And if we could find some means to climb, to reach the window open to another's heart, you might get somewhere. And now, as the wizard Prospero pronounced it, our revels are ended. Like those tempest spirits' visions, they are melted into air, into thin air. And with them the cloud-capped towers, the palaces and windmills turning shadow leave not a rack behind. until, that is, you pick up the record herein contained and returned like Oliver Sacks to the river of consciousness that winds its dreamy visions and revisions between the pages of Between Dusk and Dawn's covers. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Really? Oh, beautiful. Thank you. Oh, that's awesome. Jeez.